evening, and it came from none other than Oprah Winfrey. And the quote reads, "The greatest discovery of all time is that a person can change his future by merely changing his attitude." And as I thought about that, I thought about the fact that so many times we think about the task and all the things that we have to do when change happens, or as things are shifting in our organizations and even in our personal lives. But the fact that this quote really sums up a lot of the way that we actually create value and progress throughout life is by changing our mindset and our attitude. So that's kind of the foundation and the tone that I wanted to start this conversation with, which then takes us into a couple of disclaimers for the group. You all might have seen it in the information, obviously, about our talk tonight, but want to make sure I call a couple of things out about what this is not. So this is not an attack on change management as a widely referenced area of practice. For those of us who have either had change management in our titles or our responsibilities, I want to make sure to clarify that I'm not saying that it is not valuable at all when I introduced it as stop managing change. It's also not meant to forsake the usage of methods for us to walk through change and processes that have been found and proven to be extremely helpful in terms of giving people steps to follow as they encounter or want to implement something different. This is also not a deep dive into implementation, okay? So now that kind of the disclaimer is out there about what this is not, let's talk about what this is. This is simply a chance for us to all make a mental model shift that will help us all be better stewards of change. I'll say it again. This is intended to be a conversation that hopefully will help us all make a mental model shift to be better stewards of change. Okay? But first, I don't want to do all the talking. I want to hear from y'all. And this is my first time implementing something like this and I'll go back to this agenda in a second, but I want us to do a quick activity. You'll see there's a QR on the screen, and I want to ask a question of the group. So if you would grab your phone real quick, this will probably be the one time that you need it. And if you would grab a quick snippet of the QR code that is on the screen, you should be greeted with a question around what comes to mind when you think of change management. So I'm seeing a couple of people hop in, and you have two responses. Give me one word, one or two words that come to mind when you think of change management as a traditional concept. So let's see what pops up. Okay, seeing a couple of things come in. So I'm seeing confusion, I'm seeing people, I'm seeing uncomfortable, I'm seeing stress, I'm seeing needed, I'm seeing time, persuasion, influence, money, possibilities. Anything else that comes to mind if you haven't gotten it in? And I might interject a few. I think of training. I think of checklists. I think of tasks. I think of implementations. I think of a long period of time, perhaps, right? I see someone has added possibilities in there as well. Yep. I'm seeing influence. All of these things are great examples of what we commonly think of, and most would probably even gravitate to as we think about change management in the traditional sense. I didn't see a lot of comments on eagerness or excitement. And when we think about change in general, um, I'd like to think that having some sense of excitement or the energy or the attitude in which you approach it can also determine the attitude at which it's adapted and in which you go through it, and the way that it feels and the way that it's successful. So just wanted to kind of get the group's thoughts on the way that you might have framed change management in the past, and in hopes that we can shift what stewarding change might look like in the future. So with that, I want to just give you guys a quick view at our agenda for the conversation. We already started with what is change management to you, but I'll take us through the breakdown and how we really can take the traditional definition of it apart and start to look at it differently, perhaps. We'll then talk about an example from my work and also a personal attempt that I had just under 6 months ago at a big change. We'll be able to talk about the players in the space, the role of technology, and we'll wrap up with what it means, a simple definition of how to speak human from a communication standpoint. Okay, so digging in, I'm a big definitions guy, and I've always loved the ability to see where words come from and what they mean outside of how we've used them today. And so as I was looking at the definition of what change is, because I'm gonna break down change management, I want it to go back before we were using it maybe as a buzzword today and as a buzz phrase today. I want it to go back to maybe one of the first uses of the word change, and it dated back to a philosopher years ago, several hundred years ago, by the name of Heraclitus. And he was famously quoted by defining change as the one thing in life that is constant. So I want you to hold on to that definition alone of change, as we've broken apart change management and we're looking at the two separate words. He defined it again as one thing, the one thing in life that is constant. So I said, okay, if that is what change by itself is, it's dynamic, it's ever moving. While it can potentially be anticipated, it's something that will always happen, and it always has been happening, and it will always continue to happen. So if that's the case, then let's see what management alone means. And so I went to good old Merriam-Webster's to get the definition of management as a concept or a phrase. And it was defined as the process of dealing with or controlling things or people. And that made me go, what would happen if we put those words together? And literally looking at the definition of change from Heraclitus and Merriam-Webster's definition of management, I came up with this definition being the process of dealing with or controlling things that are constantly changing. Now, I intentionally made this definition up to stress what I think happens and what I think we encounter as we deal with change. Again, if we look at putting those two words together based on that definition, it's a process of dealing with or controlling things that are constantly changing. That then would probably explain why sometimes we feel like it's hard to wrap our arms around all that's changing. There's always a new technology. There's always a new thing that's happening, always a new implementation. People are fatigued. They're tired of all the things happening. And I think it's largely because we've tried to get such control of the thing and then try to manage the people as well without really taking a step back and looking at how can we embrace, accelerate, enhance, steward change along. And so that's where I said, you know what, maybe we've got the opportunity to look at how problematic that is in general when we try to control things that are constantly changing, even at work in our spaces. And so with that, I wanted to share maybe an example that I encountered. at work years ago when I was trying to manage something in my space. So I spent some time at one point in my career with a pretty large manufacturing organization. And there was a time where we were trying to implement a new supplier portal. It would have helped our suppliers come in and get validated quickly. We could look at labor rates and do something in a more effective and efficient way, or so we thought for our suppliers. We had hoped that it would also give us a space to go to one single place to manage things. And so we went through an entire implementation. We brought in consultants to help us kind of document and scope out what our problems were. And we had several conversations. But the one thing I found at the end of that project was we never had conversations with the people who were actually going to be in there managing the day-to-day. We didn't even interview any suppliers, if I recollect correctly. And that made me think of how much of a fail we could have had if we actually went through with another phase to actually bring that to fruition, because we didn't do a part to see, was this actually what people were looking for? Would it have actually been helpful? I think we tried our part to make things easier for us, but we didn't consider what the impacts would have been for those around us, or look at the big picture. And so as I thought about maybe how that applied to work, and maybe how many times I've even done that, not only on that project, but elsewhere, where I didn't quite look at the human element of it. I was thinking about the technology making the difference and making the change. That then made me think about, how do I approach and look at change even personally? So I want to share a quick example. You'll get to see a video shortly of a pretty big change that I couldn't have anticipated, and that I still am having a pretty difficult time trying to manage or get my hands completely around, and I don't never know if I will in the traditional sense. But I want you guys to see for yourself what I'm referring to with my change story. Here we go.
Okay, now read his shirt.
I'm pretty sure she fits.
Wait, hold on, wait.
Sorry,
Wait.
it's closed. It's full. Zoe, this woman is end state.
No way.
What does the shirt say?
Wait a minute.
What does it say?
Cancel your appointment. I'm gonna be a big brother. You lying! You lying!
I'm not.
You are lying. Are you serious?
I'm dead serious.
Are you serious? How long?
I don't know. I just went this morning.
You're lying!
I'm not.
You're lying!
Come here.
Are you for real?
Okay, so I'll pause to give context in case you're trying to figure out what on earth is going on, and if the dog in this video has shaken dog syndrome. I'm happy to report that he does not. But in fact, what you just saw was a video roughly about a year ago of me finding out that my wife was pregnant and we were expecting our first child. Now, this is not something that I had planned. This is not something that we thought was happening in that near of the future. But in an instant, things were changing around me. And I'm one of those folks who tend to go into planner mode and trying to get complete control over things as they happen. So what am I doing? I am painting nurseries. I am looking at every type of safety gadget that I can find. I am looking at already baby proofing in the school that my soon to be daughter would be going to, when it was light years away, in my effort to try and manage the change that was happening in my own life. So I'll fast forward a bit, and we see my beautiful wife. I had to show her because she's the reason why my daughter's here. But fast forward to 9 months, and we are headed to an appointment. We had done everything. Like I said, I'm a planner. And so I was trying to wrap my arms around that change as best I could. And we had planned a home birth at the time, and we were on our way to an appointment. We get there, and our midwife lets us know that my wife's water had broken, unknown to her, and that our daughter would be coming 3 weeks early that day. And if you can imagine what that does to a planner who had a home birth planned, had everything, or so he thought, laid out and ready to go, and I couldn't have even possibly anticipated a huge life change hitting like that. And so then we hit March, the 24th of this year, and this change hits our lives, our daughter. And so I introduced that as an example just to share of what it looked like for me to try and manage change and get my arms around it. There was no way I could have controlled her coming into the world when she wanted to come into the world. And so as I looked back and unpacked kind of my thought process and what happened, I noticed a couple of things were true. One, life happened, obviously, when we found out. Two, I planned and adjusted. And three, life happened again when our daughter came in the back seat of the car on I-75 on the way to the hospital. I paint that picture as a pretty extreme example of what it looks like to try and manage change when you can't. But I think of just how often we encounter that, where we spend a ton of emphasis and a ton of time on the tasks and on the trying to get things done, and we forget about the thing that's about to really change our lives. In our case, it was our daughter, but in your case at work, it could be the person that's going to be impacted or able to do something differently, the burden that could be lifted from someone, and really thinking about the human that's on the other side of the change. And so if we really start to think about it in that way of being something that one is dynamic, that can change at any given moment, and that's going to always impact others around us, I wanted to think about who are the main players in the change space. Who are those who are impacted? Obviously, we all are, but who will you typically encounter when you're dealing with, you're going through, you're trying to move some things forward? Who are those people that you'll encounter? So I want to show a quick example of those players. I don't know if you all are TikTokers or have had the opportunity to engage with some of the content, but there's a young lady who put out a video that I think accurately captures what the different players in the change space look like. So let's take a peek at it.
Do you think they're trying to get rid of all of us and just automate everything? This is the way we've always done it. I don't know how they think they're gonna get faster or better than my historical knowledge. I don't know. I'll believe it when I see it. We've been talking about transforming for years. I don't know why anybody didn't ask us, but as far as I'm concerned, this is gonna create more work for me, not less. I keep hearing different things from every single one of our leaders.
So you just saw 5 different personas of people who are going through change. Obviously, they're all impacted, but each one had a very different attitude or mindset or an approach to change. I'm sure there was one who might have been a planner or extremely interested in every single detail. There might have been someone else who didn't care. There might have been someone else who was super excited about it. And so I wanted to introduce that in a way to help us maybe anticipate the type of people that we'll meet as we are going through change, and also maybe for us to identify ourselves in some of these people and maybe where we've got opportunity areas of our own. So we'll start with the players. I wanted to narrow it down to 4 of the main players that we typically encounter or that you see as they go through change, and some of the behaviors that are associated with them. And so they include opposers, fence sitters, leaders, and I'll call them stewards. Now, I found these emojis because I thought they would pretty accurately depict maybe some of the attitude that we see as people might approach change as it happens. But as I was going through and putting this together, I thought about what would be something that was memorable and an even better actual human depiction of what it might look like as someone who encounters change. So I flipped these emojis for pictures of my daughter. I felt like she'd be a better explainer of sometimes how we tend to lean into change or not. So again, looking at the opposer, where clearly she is frustrated about something. She's likely probably hungry. You've got your fence sitter slash snoozer, just relaxing and just waiting on it to happen or not. You've got your leader who is literally leaning in and excited. And you've got your steward who is excited and ready to go, all smiles. So let's debrief them just a bit more, if we could. Opposers. So as I was looking at kind of the definition of someone who's opposing change, maybe not right out, but it's clear either in body language or in the attitude or the way that they view things. They are the type to blatantly oppose change. They're probably pretty vocal about it. And they have the tendency to believe that the organization or its leaders or even situations around them, if it's a personal thing that's going on, can't change. And the challenge with this mindset as a opposer of change is that it limits the opportunity to really see the value that's on the other side and the great things that change can bring. Now, I want to make sure I address the fact that it's not all the opposers' fault. Typically, opposers weren't always that way. They're the type who might have been part of something that was changing and it wasn't accurately communicated. They were left out of it. They felt like it happened to them and they didn't get a chance to kind of see how all the things were connected. Maybe they felt like it was poorly done and are a bit bruised, might even have some PTSD as a result of what's happened. Hence, why they typically have the position of opposing change. Now, the good thing about the opposer and why I wanted to start with them first is that they have a tendency to actually be some of your best advocates. I don't know if you've ever met someone who experienced something that was extremely negative and had an opportunity to have that situation remedied or corrected. They will be the loudest people, the biggest cheerleader if you get it right. And these are the people that you want to take special care of, certainly as someone who might steward change. And for those whose primary responsibility is helping lead others through change, these are the people that you've got to make sure you're keeping your eye on. You've got to make sure that there's active communication, that they're part of the conversation. And certainly if the change affects their daily way of working, that they are absolutely involved and brought in. Okay, so we talked opposers. Let's talk about the next type of person you might encounter or who you might be at times unknowingly. The fence sitter. So I've got this picture of my daughter. It was actually captured at the beach several months ago, and I believe she's sleeping. Now, this is not to condone sleeping at your organization or at work, but it is intended to convey kind of the tone of someone who's a fence sitter as change is taking place. And this person typically might not be sure that the organization or the people around them will change. But they aren't sure that it won't at the same time either. The thing with this group that we have to be mindful of is that it accounts for about 70% of an organization. And outside of work on a personal front, I would argue that it accounts for a lot of people as well that might be waiting on a change to come or something different to happen, but also wouldn't be surprised if it didn't. Now, the watch out with your fence sitters or your people who are just kind of waiting, maybe not actively getting up and participating or trying to help enable, is that they are the largest population. And it's easy for them to get caught on the sidelines. These are the people that we have to make sure that we're looking at how can we engage more and actively seeking their thoughts, not surveying to death, obviously, but looking for ways to engage them where they are in their day-to-day. Thinking about how we might incentivize these people to come along for the ride as well, to let them know that they're an actual member and participant and are necessary for things to be successful.
What would
So-
be some examples on how to do that, though?
Yeah, of engaging.
The fence sitters, I could be a difficult person at times.
Well, for one, I think you have to call out the fence sitter. You have to, if they're in the meeting with you and they're quiet, ask them their thoughts. These are the people who I'm sure have something to say, but might sit on it for whatever reason, might not have the comfort or might not feel like it's valuable. But I think the other thing with the fence sitter is they look for action too. I think action speaks louder than words for them. So these are the people who you can't give lip service to. It's going to require follow-up to actually get them to get engaged. That's a great question. Anyone else, or was that helpful?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. So continuing on with the types of people that we might encounter when dealing with change, we've got our champions and leaders. So I love this picture of my daughter because literally not only is she leaning in, but there's a certain element of curiosity in her eyes. There's a level of wanting to know more or being engaged. And if we think about how to define these individuals, they're the ones that are usually inspired by the possibilities of change. They might have tons of ideas in their heads about what needs to change. They're probably innovators and could even be the ones that think about the pie in the sky, and you might have to reel these people in. But even if they don't have the skills to actually deliver a change, they are the crucial sources to help influence. And typically these people are in senior leadership roles. They're the ones who can help rally the troops. They might have the loudest voice. And if they are on your side, they are absolutely the leader and can help be the champion of what's going on. So I know an example of how you might engage this person is one, early, making sure that before you go through the process of trying to implement, before you even explore something or you want to go through discovery, ask for thoughts, knowing that those people who are leaders have the loudest voice and often large networks. Engage them for ways to connect with people in their spaces, seek to understand and learn the organizational structure, understand maybe what's worked in the past in terms of how things have been communicated, and offer to brainstorm with those individuals, because partnering with them and getting them on your side again helps them to be advocates and champions for change. Certainly makes it easier. Okay, so we've talked about the person who opposes change. We talked about the fence sitter. We talked about someone who might champion change. Want to then talk about where all of us, regardless of title, regardless of even tenure, and even personally, should dwell on an ongoing basis. And that's in the space of a steward. So in this picture, you'll see my daughter with hands raised. You can tell she's excited about something. I don't know what, but in this example, I selected it because these individuals, just from an attitude and tone perspective, are often the first to the party. They're the quickest to embrace and want to navigate the change. They might be the ones to raise hands, to say, how can I help? They're rolling up their sleeves, trying to figure out what does good look like. Even if it might be difficult or even if it's unexpected, certainly as that happens in life, they're the ones who tend to roll with the punches and are absolutely the ones to have on the team. These individuals typically don't have to be persuaded because they know that on the other side, there's value creation on the other side. It's probably peace of mind. On the other side is what people have been waiting on, and they're always looking for opportunities to engage and understand the impacts for other people as well to make it easier for those around them. Any questions on stewards from a characteristics or attitude perspective? Okay.
How do you keep your stewards motivated though?
Absolutely. I think for one, making sure that you don't fatigue the stewards. For example, I know oftentimes people will get caught up in one implementation after the next. And if you're not careful, you overwhelm even the people who love the new things that are going on. So making sure that you allow them to challenge your thoughts, to challenge what's coming down, to also be the voice of everyone else because they're probably boots on the ground. They've got connection to those who are closest to potentially maybe the problem, making sure that they have an active seat at the table and are part of that decision-making group is absolutely how I'd make sure that you're keeping the stewards motivated. So it doesn't feel like they're being run over, having to implement and carry and own all the change by themselves, if that makes sense. Was that helpful?
Yes, it was.
Cool. So we've talked about the type of people that you might encounter. Want to spend a little bit of time on how to communicate. And I want to make it as simple as possible in a one-liner. But before getting into that one-liner, want to give an example recently that I learned about communication. Someone asked, how do you tell a story? And they gave an example of it having kind of your initial setup, the scenario, setting the tone, describing what it was, and making sure that you had a wow at the end of it to really hook people. And they gave two examples of how to do that. You could be extremely dry and just give the detail, the facts, and leave it there. You could overdo it and give way too much and speak in language that people do not understand. Or you could absolutely be intentional with who you're communicating with. And the individual who gave that example to me told me that every time she sends either a message or she's working on a scope of work, a statement of work, she actually sends it to her mother of 84 years to look at. And if her mom cannot understand it, she goes back and reworks it. She also does the same with her kids. Literally will have her kids look at an example of what she's trying to share, and she'll ask them questions. Do you understand what I'm saying? Do you understand what I'm looking for? Does this make sense? And that made me think about communication in general. I think this was one of the words that came up in the word cloud earlier around what we typically think about when we hear the words change management. And unfortunately, so much time goes into crafting messaging that we want to sound a certain way, and potentially, depending on the audience, might be extremely complex. But I was really challenged when I heard of that individual asking her mother, who's had several years of experience, or even her kids, for feedback on how to make this simpler. So with that, the one liner for how do you communicate that I was able to come up with was this. It's saying the right thing to the right person at the right time in the simplest way. Thinking about a change that's about to come out, how do you prioritize the timing of it? How do you prioritize the individual that it's going to? Do they have access to email? Do they have access to a mobile device? Do they open up regular mail? Are they people who you would typically post something on a site or at the site on an actual board? Getting to that level of granularity, while I wouldn't even venture to try and go down the path of uh, giving every example of what a communication would look like, the essence of how we communicate and the attitude to approach communication from is making sure that it's the right thing to the right person at the right time and in the most simplest form. And so hopefully, as we are all trying to be better stewards of change and are navigating it as best we can, we think of how we can take a step back to make our communication simpler. What is it that the person needs? And no more. How can we even share what's in it for them? How does it actually make their lives easier? How does it change their day-to-day for the better? Does it save time? Does it save effort? How do we make sure that what we're actually trying to do is helping the people that we're asking to come along the journey and that we're trying to convince? I mean, we talked about those attitudes earlier and the different personas you'd encounter. What is the right thing to someone who has been kind of scarred from change in the past? It's probably an invitation to invite them for feedback. Or for the person who's on the fence, it's calling them out and asking for their thoughts. For the leader, it's who are your influencers in your network? How do you communicate with them? And really seeking to understand. So what I don't want to do with this one-liner is simplify it as if it's the easiest thing to do. It takes work, it takes effort, obviously, but if we think about how big of an impact change can have on the people around us and on the projects that we're working on and through, it's worth taking the time to lean in and really understand who our people are and what's the right time, the right means or method to get information to them. Any questions here? Okay. Take that as a no, but based on what we've talked about so far, I mean, we've looked at certainly who you might encounter when dealing with change, or maybe even saw ourselves in terms of attitudes. We've looked at the breakdown of change and management, and maybe why it's problematic to approach it from a mental model perspective, not a process, but from a mental model perspective, as trying to manage something that is dynamic as change. And so wanted to transition into technology and understanding what the role of technology is as it relates to change. So if we go back to the example I shared earlier, I'd mentioned I was working on a implementation for a supplier portal for a pretty large organization. And I remember hearing some folks say, you know, when this tool comes out, it will fix our problems. And I cringed when I heard it, because I thought about the fact that the problem wasn't necessarily the implementation of the tool. It was the fact that people didn't know where to go. It was the fact that suppliers felt disconnected. It was the fact that there were several different processes for managing things. It was the fact that it took a long time. It was also the fact that, quite frankly, things were not organized all over the place. There were several different organizations doing different things, and I don't think everyone was on the same sheet of music at the time. And even with a tool or technology being in place, there's no stopping people from potentially doing that same behavior in that new tool if they approach it as the tool being the fix for the problem. So as I looked at that example back in the past of where people looked at the technology being the solution or the savior for change, that made me think about its true role, if you will. And from a definition perspective, technology is simply the application of knowledge for practical purposes, especially in industry. And so, if that's the definition of it, how might that apply to how we look at or leverage technology and its role? And that's what got me to the point of understanding it to be something that should merely streamline documentation, increase transparency, improve communication, engagement, and feedback. But in and of itself, without the people, there would be no way for it to truly be successful. So I know there's a lot of emphasis on the tools that we use, and this is not to forsake the discovery and the amount of time that we spend qualifying tools and looking at ways to do things better and improve processes. But at the end of the day, if the focus is not around the people who are actually going to be in the tool and doing the things, and if it's not actually helping them, and if they don't have a role really in its evolution and how it's going to continue to grow and get better, it runs the risk of failure. And then the technology gets blamed for being the problem. So just wanted to make sure that we put technology in its rightful place as an enabler and not the solution, and also not the focus when we think about change in general. The people that are part of it, that are going to be using it, that are on the other end of it, that are the recipients of it, they are the focus as we look at change. Any questions here just on the role of technology in general?
So when you're talking about technology and
Yeah.
implementation,
Hmm.
so example like implementing a CRM
Hmm.
into a workplace,
Yep.
and say it's a global organization implementation. And so that's going to bring across change, specifically in the sales team, customer experience team, and those
Absolutely.
things there. So, and you're saying that it should be, before we get to streamlining and making things more efficient, there is that in between phase, that that forming stage, if we're thinking about, building a team where you're trying to engage the technology, implement it on something like that. So all of that change and that communication. And so how do you handle and manage, well, you're not managing change. How do we embrace it?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
I think part of the thing to make sure that we're considering is, again, who is actually a part of it. So looking at all the parties that are involved. We talked about obviously your leaders, the decision makers, if you will, who would actually sign off on something like that happening, the people who are going to be using it, looking at the people who would have responsibility for getting people up to speed or upskilling others on it. All of those members, or at least having a subset of a representation of those folks, should be pulled in way before a decision is made to even explore the possibility. I think sometimes that's where things are missed, where we don't have an opportunity, or we forget to pull in people who would actually be the ones being a part of this from a day-to-day perspective. And as you pull those people in, looking at how they work, how they communicate today, and how you might want to change that in the future. For your example with the CRM, asking those people what the pain points are, really exploring opportunities to fix that, and not focusing just on the tool itself, but really fixing the problems that the people are having. That'll, one, probably help whoever's coming in to implement and bring the tool to the organization to do a better job the first time and do it on budget and on time. But also it will certainly help those who are on the fence about it, and hopefully turn around the attitude of the person who's the resistor or opposer of change. Is that helpful?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. Awesome. So I want to go back, since we've talked a bit about who you encounter. First, we talked about some examples of why change management in the traditional sense leads to trying to manage something that is dynamic versus looking at being a shepherd or a steward of it. We've talked about kind of the role of technology and different ways to communicate and why it's important to make sure that it is simple and it's targeted and it's timely. So I want to go back maybe to change management as a definition and why I'm exploring the idea of stopping change management in the traditional sense from a mindset perspective. And so going back again, change management broken down and then pieced back together could be defined as the process of dealing with or controlling things that are constantly changing. And if we looked at all of those examples, I think it'd be fair to say that it's impossible to try and wrap arms completely around all the technologies that are going to get upgraded and going to shift years from now, or all the different things and innovations that continue to hit that constantly become difficult to keep up with. So if that's the case, and we really wanted to step away from that as a mental model, how would it look then if we inserted a different word instead of management, again, from a mindset, not a process standpoint? So I started to look at words that end in ship, such as leadership or stewardship. And ship, by definition, tends to refer to a state of being or an act. It's ongoing. It has no intention of being a task or a one-time thing. It's intended to be a way of doing things, a way of thinking and approaching things, an attitude, if you will, of doing something. And so I played a little game of replacing and did a quick switcheroo to reframe it as change stewardship. And again, I'm not the owner or the originator of change management in general, but I know for me, it was really helpful to reframe in my mind as I think about change that has happened to me personally, that continues to happen organizationally. I thought changing it to stewardship as a mental model would help me do a better job of being someone who stewards change, who raises my hand to look for opportunities to move it along, to challenge as it doesn't make sense, to invite others and energize others in my space. And so whether it's steward for you or it's leadership for you, wanted to challenge us all to really think about how we can be better enablers in the attitude that we bring, in the ideas that we raise, in the way that we think about change in general, so that that attitude actually helps change to do what it's supposed to do, and that's create value if we allow it to. Any questions so far there? Okay, I want to step into how do we act as stewards, because I know it's easy to say change stewardship, got it, definition, that makes sense, but how do you actually act as a steward? So I looked at my life, as you all learned earlier. I'm a new dad of a 6-month-old, and so I wanted to look at, well, how do I act in my personal life as a steward, as a parent, perhaps? And so that got me to thinking about how I make sure that my daughter's needs are provided for. So there's provision of needs, there's cultivation of her skills, there's easing of fears, there's addressing of her concerns, there's navigation of her wants. And as she continues to grow, there's going to be coaching as an adult. And as I looked at all of those as kind of some examples of how I might act as a steward, as a parent, that made me think about the fact that it literally is going to show up every single day. There's no end date. There's no go live officially of these. This is going to be something that I'm always having to do in a way that I'm always having to show up for her. So then how does that maybe apply to work? So I was looking at another example of maybe an employee, and we can take a restaurant employee as an example of how they might act as a steward as things are changing, or to be a better representation of the company. And so an example of how someone might act as a steward as an employee in a restaurant might be greeting patrons, taking reservations, escorting guests to tables, answering phone calls, giving basic information, preparing for guests by cleaning and setting tables. And I thought this one was interesting because of just the amount of care that went into looking at the guest, or preparing for the guest. The attitude is that's inviting, it's welcoming. It's not hand holding, but in the escorting guests to tables, there's no confusion about where you're going. So it's clear. In the answering phone calls, there's help, there's support that's part of it. And then the last bullet point about preparation, I thought that was pretty powerful as we think about stewardship in general, because part of being a good steward is making sure that you're prepared and that everything makes sense before you invite someone in to be part two. So then I started to think about all of us and the work that we do and the spaces that we're in. How can we individually act as stewards? And so I pose this question, not for us to answer in this very moment, but certainly for us to ponder on and think about, how will we act as a steward, as a member of Slalom, as a member of insert your organization? What does that mean you're doing? What is the attitude of that, of a steward versus that of someone who is typically trying to manage? Because at the end of the day, we have responsibility to be good stewards of the people that are on our teams, of the projects, of the resources that are part of our organizations. That's our obligation. So I challenge everyone, regardless of where you are and what your space is, to think about how you can act as a steward of change as you encounter it. Okay. So with that, we've talked about the people, we've talked about communication and the role of technology, and kind of reframing this idea of change management into being a steward of change, that if we follow our process, regardless of which one it is, in the traditional sense, that it can help us actually create value, be more connected with our teams, so on and so forth. And so what's the outcome as we look at being stewards of change? Just a couple of thoughts to share with you all. For one, clarity, peace of mind, perhaps, for people who are on the other side of change. The outcome of being a better steward, or a good steward rather, of change is also organizational value creation. As you look at the ease of which you encounter and deal with things that come, it's much less of something that's daunting and more of a embraced thing that happens and allows you to more nimbly approach problems and things as life continues to happen, as tools continue to change, as environments continue to shift. When we are stewards of change and look at opportunities to, again, embrace it, I think the outcome overall is extremely positive, and you land in a much better place at the end of the day. Any questions so far there? So if not, I want to pause and get us to a point where we can engage in a little bit of dialogue. I've got a screenshot and I'll share it because it's got all the notes and things for you to keep. But want to have a little bit of Q&A, certainly of those who are actively going through something, or you've got an example of maybe what stewarding change has looked like for you. I think that could be extremely helpful to talk through and have some dialogue on, if that's okay. So any questions or comments?
Seems like this group is really quiet today. Or they're eating because it is 6:30 and it's dinner
It
time.
is. It
Mhm.
is dinner time.
So I have a question. Is
Yeah.
there a way to motivate the hang on, let me go back to my notes. The champions into stewards
A way to motivate the champions
or
into
convert
stewards.
them into stewards.
Yeah. So part of that motivation, and again, this is a bit of my opinion here, is around really challenging thoughts, bringing them down to reality. I think we see champions from time to time also having a lot of ideas and being the first to idea vomit, if you will, for those who are around them, especially if they're in a leadership role. Level setting and bringing them down to earth around, hey, this is what people are actually saying. This is where you're most needed. This is what would actually help us be most successful, helping them to understand the role that they play, not just from a visibility perspective, but where they can create the most value. I see that as being one of the ways to increase how effective they are as a champion, because as a champion, you are a steward. I think by default, I think the level is just a bit different in terms of where you sit and how connected you are. But I'd recommend obviously challenging back on some of the ideas, but more than that, making sure that you're reinforcing what is needed from them so that it's clear, as you can communicate that to others, and so things can be successful, that they know the role that they're playing. Does that make sense? And is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely. Other thoughts or questions?
I just wanted to say thank you very much for the great reminder of how empowering it is to be a steward. Like if you're not the one making the decisions, you can still have a positive influence on
Yeah.
those around you. And it's empowering where you don't feel helpless, even though you can't make any changes yourself per se. So that's great.
Absolutely. Definitely appreciate that. To that comment, looking back and as I was putting this together, the first thing that came to mind when I thought about change was not a work situation. I used my daughter intentionally because that was something that completely flipped all of my plans and what I thought we were going to do at what point upside down. And if that happens personally, I can only imagine when a tool or something from a market perspective shifts and impacts thousands of individuals at the same time. So if I can maybe look at how I can be a better participant personally, hopefully that'll shape how I can participate and bring that same type of positivity and an attitude to the changes that go on at work too. Other comments?
We got some comments in the chat.
Okay, let me take a peek. I've seen it play out time and time again. So a comment, love the compassion and empathy involved in stewardship. I see this being helpful when helping others navigate change. There's also an opportunity to act as a steward towards yourself and bring that same compassion when you're noticing the pains of navigating your own feelings. I think that's a great call out, Megan. Just around looking introspectively. I didn't realize as I was putting those different slides together around the type of people you encounter, how I've been one of those people at one point in my career, um, admittedly. And so taking a step back to also pinpoint where am I and why am I there? I think is a great exercise for us to individually do, but then also looking at um, for our teams and for those who are obviously going to be impacted by change, how can we do more of that to understand where they are and tailor our approach so it doesn't feel like a blanket approach to change. But great comment. Anything else or other comments, questions?
Josiah, as
Yeah.
you were talking, I was thinking about the LMS that our organization implemented last year.
Okay.
So we implemented an LMS for our external customers. We're a professional services organization that trains customers.
Okay.
And so we had everybody else on the team. We had, all of our educational services people on the team to determine what kind of LMS we needed. And however, we didn't talk to the customer because they were the ones that were going to be interacting with it.
Yeah.
And now what's happening is that a lot of customers, when we made that change, they're not happy with trying to log into our LMS to take training. It just seems so cumbersome for them.
Right.
And it feels like if we had at least had some of the customers kind of surveyed them or at least talked to them about what they were looking for in that experience, that we would have either made a different choice of LMS or we might have been able to mitigate some of the feelings and the pain points that they're experiencing.
Absolutely. I'm curious with that as an example, is there any feedback method that's built into the current LMS?
So there is feedback, but it's basically feedback on the class that they took. So it's more about the instructor.
The content.
Correct. It's nothing about this is what we would have preferred to have as far as the way that this LMS was structured.
Mm-hmm.
And the only other feedback that people are receiving is they're receiving the feedback that comes from the instructor when we are feeling the pain of how a customer is trying to interact with it, or our training department are fielding questions because people don't understand how to log in.
Interesting. I wonder, not to solution, but if there might be an opportunity to make that question part of the curriculum at the end of the LMS. I mean, it's one thing to ask, obviously, the question about the content, but your experience overall. I don't know if there's vendor functionality to do that either, or even if that could be something that people take, a feedback LMS, just to literally provide candid feedback around this is what my experience has been, for you to collect some of that real time too.
That's a really good suggestion. I'll definitely pass that along.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts or examples? I know that was a really good one, certainly, of what happens when you encounter change and you've gone through it and then are now at the other side and then realize there's still an opportunity. I think that's a good example of it never is too late to, one, go back, ask questions, and again, continue to iterate. That's what the journey of change is about as well. Okay, I don't see any other questions or comments in chat. No, I don't think I hear anyone else unmuted. So I'll go back to this one pager. And for those who are screenshotters or you like to kind of see all the things on one page, wanted to summarize a couple of thoughts for us around being stewards of change, and defining change stewardship obviously as the condition of being a steward. And if you want to replace steward with leader, be my guest, because there is absolutely a ton of emphasis and importance on those who sit in leadership and highly influential roles. And there's a sense of ownership and responsibility that comes with that. The second area was around the role of technology and really putting it in its place to be an enabler of change, not the solution, but an enabler to help change along. On the communication front, making sure that you get the right thing to the right person at the right time, again, in the simplest way. And for those of you who either have children or other people to get some eyes on it, get some eyes on some of the communication just to see, does it make sense to someone else? Again, it's best to keep things simple for people to understand it, for it to land as well. And then the last area was around thinking about the players. Again, you've got your opposers, your fence sitters, your leaders, your stewards. We don't discount anyone in this group. And we validate the fact that feelings towards change are real and are absolutely valid, but want to make sure that we think about how we care for those who might be in these roles or feeling these ways, that we're also intentional about how we steward them too. So that is all I had in terms of content itself. I wanted to make sure I left a bit of space for any questions or commentary, but I'm also not an advocate of holding people hostage too when it comes to timing. I know the hour is in the evening, and definitely appreciate you all for spending your dinner, maybe early dinner time with me. But that is all I had in terms of content. Any other questions or thoughts perhaps to add, Neil?
Oh, no. So for one of my organizations, I'm implementing a lot of change. So definitely for those who are on the call, be cautious of how much change you try to force down the pipeline. So in addition to implementing a CRM, I'm also changing our accounting system and a few things at the same time. And there's these in-between phases where you want these systems to communicate with each other. And we think technology is supposed to happen instantaneously.
Yeah.
And I'm learning that it doesn't work that way. Might take about 48 hours for things to actually truly. So you need managing your own expectations in the change management process is probably what I think is a really good thing, is, understanding what the success look like, but then also what's realistic, and what you can expect from your team and your employees. I've found to be very beneficial.
Absolutely. That's a great ad, and just another nod at the fact that you are an extremely busy person. But
Well,
absolutely
I
love to see
implement
it.
change for other people as well. So
Which I think that's a lovely segue, sir, into just some thanks that I want to make sure that I don't let us get off the phone without doing. It's obviously a pleasure to have an invitation from Neil, obviously representing the best workplace. And you spoke about a couple of things that you're doing in that space, but certainly give you the floor if there's anything else you'd like to share just from a best workplace perspective. Wanted to make sure I shouted you and best workplace out.
Oh, I thank you. So yes, the best workplace, definitely our goal is our name, but also we enjoy partnering with ATD Greater Atlanta as far as being able to provide and then elevate those other consultants that are around us, such as the up and coming leaders like Josiah Owens and some of the ones that are on this call as well. Please just keep in mind that, hey, ATD is here to support and to help upskill. And for the chapter, I am the immediate past president, and I would definitely like to say that its members If you have topics that you would like to discuss, or you are a subject matter expert in that space, definitely reach out to the chapter about being able to put on a program. Something that we open up in open arms and welcome. I'm just talking to our program leaders to see where it falls, and especially now that the new leadership board is getting ready to start. I think the results came out today, so that we can start planning for 2023. But feedback is great. Feedback is a gift. So if there are tools, resources, topics, and things that not only does your organization need, but you need as an individual, let the chapter leaders know, like myself. Reach out to us via LinkedIn, email, whatever it might be, so that we can look at curating those topics and bringing that to you, so that we can help you in your professional career. I definitely want to put that outreach out there so that you know as well.
Absolutely. And again, want to also shout out Greater Atlanta chapter of ATD, just for the platform to share and to do a bit of knowledge sharing. Want everyone to make sure that you also patronize the calendar, because I know there are a lot of other great knowledge shares that are going to be coming up. And certainly, if you've not already, please connect with me. Like Neil said, feedback is a gift. So share it. Always looking for ways to communicate more effectively, and to also engage others through knowledge sharing. So certainly bring it my way if you would. Other than that, I think that's all I've got. I appreciate you all. I think this has been recorded as well, so I'm sure it'll be
It is.
housed. Okay, it'll be housed somewhere too.
So I'll speak to our VP of technology to make sure it goes on our YouTube channel.
Cool. Good
And
deal.
if you do not follow us on social media, please do.
Please.